to his teaching. Can you hear me okay? Because I don't know if my internet connection is doing well. Hello? Oh, okay.
Sounds
I see
good.
a thumbs up. So, okay, good. I think we have Professor Spellmeyer here in two capacities. He's, as you've heard from his teaching, he's a professor of English or English literature, and he's also a Zen master. So we have him here in both capacities, perhaps a little bit more in the Zen capacity today. But he's published a number of books, including Arts of Living, Reinventing the Humanities for the 21st Century, A New Humanities Reader, Common Ground, Dialogue, Understanding, and the Teaching of Composition. And he's working on a new project, World Without End, Saving the Humanities in an Age of Specialization. And of course, many articles as well. So that's a brief introduction of his academic side, but I also want to introduce his Zen side or his Zen lineage. Professor Spellmeyer, or Kurt, is a lineage holder in the line of Obaku Zen or Huangbo Chan, and he received his transmission from Glenn Webb, Kangan, and studied at the Seattle Zen Center, also with Takabayashi Genki as another teacher there. And the Obaku lineage traces back to China, and the founder, Inyuan Longqi or Ingen Ryuki, back in the 17th century. And so even Glenn Webb, he got his transmission in Japan, but he also visited China, and his transmission was authenticated at the Hanshansi monastery there. So Kurt is in this lineage, a Chinese lineage that turned Japanese, and a Japanese lineage that has now turned American. So he has a very interesting lineage and interesting background, and he already has 4 Dharma heirs of his own, including our own Zhang Jiaru Lao Shi, who's here today. And it's through Professor Zhang that I met Professor Spellmeyer 4 years ago, and even though we've never met in person, I consider him a friend and mentor, and I'm glad to have him here today. So I'd like to welcome Professor Spellmeyer.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's great to see you, Jeffrey, and thank you all for coming this evening or this morning. The title of the talk is really like After Emptiness. What comes after emptiness in your practice? And let me hold on just a second. Let me put this up here. Can everybody see that okay? Is that large enough?
Please bigger. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, is that okay? Is that adequate?
A little bigger.
Bigger?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
How's that?
That's good. Thank you.
Is that visible to everybody?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to start my talk today by referencing one of the main teaching texts in Chan tradition, the Bianlu, the Blue Cliff Record. And this is case one. It's sometimes translated as the highest meaning of the holy truths. It's also sometimes translated just as vast emptiness. Yuan Wu, the editor, wrote this at the beginning of each of the little koans. He writes a little note or pointer, what to look for. He says, when you see smoke on the other side of a mountain, you already know there is a fire. When you see horns on the other side of a fence, right away you get to know there is an ox there. To understand three when one is raised, to judge precisely at a glance, this is the everyday food and drink of a patch-robed monk. Getting to where he cuts off the myriad streams, he is free to arise in the east and sink in the west, to go against or to go with in any and all directions, free to give or to take away. But say at such a time, whose actions are these? Look into Shui Tou's trailing vines. Okay, here's the main subject. Emperor Wu of Liang asked the great master Bodhidharma, what is the highest meaning of the holy truths? Bodhidharma said, emptiness without holiness. The emperor said, who is facing me? Bodhidharma said, I don't know. The emperor did not understand. After this, Bodhidharma crossed the Yangtze River and came to the kingdom of Wei. Later, the emperor brought this up to Master Che and asked him about it. Master Che asked, does your majesty know who this man is? The emperor said, I don't know. Master Che said, he is the Mahasattva Avalokiteshvara, Guan Yin, transmitting the Buddha mind seal. The emperor felt regretful, so he wanted to send an emissary to invite Bodhidharma to return. Master Che told him, your majesty, don't say that you will send someone to fetch him back. Even if the whole country were to go after him, he still wouldn't return. Okay, so that's our text. Okay, let me say just a few things about this. This is like the first koan in this collection, and it's really about the importance of emptiness for the path. Basically in the pointer, Mumon or Wumen is saying, I'm sorry, pardon me, Wan Wu is saying, we normally use our calculating minds. So if we see smoke on some side of the mountain, we know there's a fire. If we see horns above a fence, we know there's an ox there. But this is a different kind of awareness. It's wuxin. It's where we cut off our discriminating understanding and dwell in emptiness. So that's the pointer. And then I should say that Emperor Wu of Liang really existed. This meeting probably happened around 520 of the Common Era. And Emperor Wu of Liang was a really interesting person. He came to power after a really terrible ruler in Liang. Let me go ahead and stop sharing this. He came to power after a really terrible ruler named, you don't need to know his name, but he was crazy, destructive. In fact, he was so bad that he is said by historical records to have held orgies in a room that he had wallpapered with human flesh. He was so terrible that his own generals murdered him finally. And we live in a time where stories like this make more sense than they might have only recently, because in my country, in the United States, we have a person who's not quite as bad as this person I'm describing, but who clearly is mentally unbalanced and thinks nothing of killing lots of people. So Emperor Wu rose to power after this terrible ruler, and he was a devout Buddhist. He studied the sutras, he studied all the commentaries, he built beautiful monasteries, and he recruited eminent monks from China to come and talk to the people. In fact, he was so attracted to Buddhism that he would go himself up to the monasteries that he built and stay there for the weekend. His court were afraid that he would actually give up being emperor and just become a monk. That didn't happen. So, you have a terrible situation. You have a ruler who studies the sutras, who takes seriously the precepts, and creates this wonderful new society. But what happens after this is really interesting. At the end of his life, he was murdered by his successor, and Liang entered another period of instability. And if we look at this in history, we look at events like this in history, we look at somebody like Wu of Liang, who really applies Buddhism to his life, who follows the precepts, who follows the sutras, who studies them. You think, how can this go wrong? How can a society go wrong? But the problem with even the precepts, even the sutras, even the life of, the monastic regulations, the problem with this is that none of these guarantee that we will really be liberated from our illusions. And in fact, actually, when we study the sutras, or we read or follow the precepts, we understand the precepts in terms of our own, you could say, karma. So if we're greedy and selfish, we will interpret the sutras in ways that support our being greedy and selfish. We will interpret the precepts in ways that, or scriptures in ways that support our, you could say, distorted understanding. And, this is why philosophers are not always wise, and lawyers and judges are not always honest. When we receive ideas, they don't really free us from our illusions. We can interpret those ideas in ways that reinforce our illusions. And this is, I think, something that Dhammo was trying to communicate to the emperor, right? We can go to the temple if we're East Asians, and we can light incense and pray for help on a big test. Or if we're in the West, we can take classes on mindfulness to make us more efficient in our high-pressure jobs. But Dhammo understood that this wasn't going to actually set us free. Using the Dharma to adapt to everyday life leaves everyday life unchallenged and unchanged. Of course, it's important to do your job, to be a good parent, to be a good daughter or son. It's good, it's important to get good grades in school. But if we're just trying to fit into our society, if we're just using our Buddhist practice to help ourselves in everyday life, we're not paying attention to the ways that everyday life itself is unhealthy and destructive. Please consider for just a moment, if you read the newspaper, and I I do every day after meditation, you know, there's not just one genocide going on in our world. There's a number of them. In places like Yemen, half the population is in danger of starving to death right now because of conflict. So just trying to adjust to life, just trying to lead a good life by the standards of our society is not really liberating for us. It may not even be healthy. If you have a high stress job and you meditate to reduce your stress, the job remains high stress, the demands remain punishing and unhelpful to you, right? So the Buddha himself was really straight about this. In one of his earliest sutras, he said, the world is on fire. The eye is on fire, the ear is on fire. And what he meant by that is our confusion is so great that it even distorts our immediate sensory experience. So we don't have to become monks and nuns, but like the Buddha, we have to leave home. We have to turn our backs on everything that we are told to accept as truth and reality. I would say that the Buddha did not begin his noble search for enlightenment by looking for teachings of the kind we associate with religion. We understand the Buddha as a religious teacher, but I don't think his goal was to find a truth he could communicate, like, the Ten Commandments in Judaism, or the Sermon on the Mount in Christianity, or the Quran. I don't actually even think that he saw himself as a quote-unquote religious thinker. I don't think he was looking for a religious experience. And I don't think he wanted to understand objective reality either. What he understood early in his life was that beliefs are constructions conditioned by their contexts. And this is one of the reasons he rejected philosophy. He rejected the dominant Vedic religion of his time. And he also rejected the materialism, that was very popular. Buddha argued with a lot of different philosophers, and many of them were materialists. So he wasn't looking for a new philosophy, he wasn't looking for a new religion, and he didn't accept the existence of an objective reality. Instead of looking for better beliefs, the Buddha wanted to understand the way beliefs, ideas, and mental images get constructed. And this led him to turn his attention to consciousness, right? Not to the objects of consciousness, to language, thought, or the objects of perception, but to the way the mind itself puts together our images of reality, right? So, in philosophy, there's a school of thought called phenomenology. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. But, it means let's go to the most immediate experience of consciousness itself. And that's what the Buddha wanted to do. He said, forget about what you read in the scriptures, forget about what the philosophers have told you, and forget about what actually, scientists have to say. Go back to your immediate experience. So, just to put it a little differently, to understand reality, the Buddha felt that he needed to understand the consciousness that constructs our image of reality. And to understand that consciousness, he engaged in a step-by-step deconstruction of his immediate experience. This process of deconstruction is like taking apart consciousness itself piece by piece, is described in some of the very earliest Buddhist texts, where the Buddha, on the cushion in his meditation, moves backward through more and more elementary states or spheres of awareness. These are called in Pali the jhanas. So like Zen is actually comes from the word jhana. Chan comes from the word jhana in Sanskrit and Pali. Okay, so the Buddha realized that there isn't really such a thing as one objective reality. What we experience in the world is constructed or constructed by our consciousness. So if we are an angry person, we construct an angry world, right? And that affects our experience in many different ways. If we're fearful, that affects the way we experience the world. So he said, we can't trust our own experience of the world. We can't trust it. So the way we need to liberate ourselves from our illusions is to go back through the mind and take it apart, level by level, layer by layer. So, this is like deconstructing the mind, taking it apart. And he has these layers, right? I mean, the top layer, you could say, is the layer that thinks in language, and under that layer, there's a layer that, basically like fragments of thoughts. Under that layer, there's a layer where suddenly you feel very serene, very calm. There's a layer where actually language sort of disappears and you're just aware of your senses, right? There's like just a sense. So he goes through all of these different layers of the mind. You could say down, down, down. And at the core of the mind, he finds this absolute emptiness, you could say. There's like a 0 point of absolute emptiness. It's like pure awareness without any object at all, okay? And this is the great emptiness that Damo tries to tell Emperor Wu of Liang about, right? So, Emperor Wu of Liang still believes that if he studies the sutras, if he builds monasteries, if he becomes a vegetarian, which I highly recommend, he will be freeing himself from illusion. He generously donated huge sums of money to the Sangha of monks and nuns. He built libraries, he built, a pagoda, but, Damo said, actually, none of this really liberates you. What you need to do is go back step by step through your mind until you reach this 0 point of emptiness, right? And many of you here are studying with Jaru. In fact, all of you here are studying with Jaru. And I think you've all begun to understand Damo's message, to Emperor Wu, right? I don't mean that you've understood it intellectually, although you may have. But I think, in your practice, you're beginning to enter that state yourself and to experience that emptiness in your flesh and your bones. You've begun to experience and as you've begun to experience the vast emptiness that Damo described, it might seem intuitively obvious that the Buddha's experience of enlightenment, of emptiness, was what brought him to enlightenment. It seems obvious that if you just go through the layers of the mind and you peel away all of those layers, you get to this 0 point of emptiness. And when you sit in that emptiness, it feels so beautiful and so serene that you might think, this is it, this is liberation. And in fact, many people today, when they meditate, when they are able to enter a state of emptiness, timeless, serene emptiness. And if you're not experiencing that yet, please keep meditating because you will. Many people think this is it, this is liberation. And in fact, there are definitely meditation teachers in India today who teach that is liberation, right? But actually, the Buddha did not achieve enlightenment by entering deep emptiness. That's not where his practice eventually took him. The Buddha himself didn't discover emptiness on his own. He went to one of the greatest meditation masters of his time, a person named Alara Kalama. The sutras tell us his name, and there's actually historical records that he actually existed. So the Buddha went to see Alara Kalama and became his student early in his journey towards enlightenment. And he was able, under Alara's guidance, to enter deep Ushin, right? And I should say, unless you can enter deep Ushin, you can never free yourself. You can never have the enlightenment experience. But when the Buddha entered deep Ushin, he realized this is not enough. This is not enlightenment. Yeah. So Alara had offered the Buddha the chance to become his student and co-teacher. He said, if you stay with me, Siddhartha, I will make you my colleague, and when I die, you will inherit my order of practitioners, right? And the Buddha said, listen, I'm sorry, I have to leave because this is not enlightenment. He decided that emptiness itself is not true liberation. So what Damo says to Emperor Wu of Liang is true, but there's more to the path than what he communicates. Emperor Wu thinks that ideas and actions and experiences can be liberating, but he's mistaken. You have to go through the door of emptiness, but emptiness does not enlighten you fully, okay? So that's the point. So if the Buddha didn't awaken by entering the deepest possible emptiness, how did he awaken, right? And I'd like to share with you one account of how that happened. Hold on just a second. Okay. Is this visible to everybody? Is that big enough? Is that okay? Okay, let me go down a little bit. Hold on just a second. Okay. The Buddha this is called a Nikaya. This is like really early Buddhism. And the Nikayas are in Sanskrit, they're called agamas. They exist in Chinese Buddhism also. They're part of the Chinese Tripitaka, the Chinese collection of sutras. But the Buddha said that after he could go into the deepest emptiness, he meditated. You may know the story, right? You probably know the story. The Buddha started studying with Alara Kalama, and then he went on and studied with another meditation master named Udraka Ramaputra. And then he still didn't feel like he had achieved enlightenment, so he went off on his own. And everybody who's a Buddhist knows the story that he nearly starved himself to death trying to wake up. He was practicing with 5 other people who were trying to wake up on their own, having given up on their teachers. And the Buddha almost died from starvation, and he was just about to die, and he thought, this is really pointless. This is not working out. I'm not getting any closer to enlightenment. I'm just killing myself. So he went to a village nearby, and a woman saw him, a farm girl saw him, and was so moved by this absolutely emaciated boy, really, that she made some rice and milk for him. And when he ate the rice and milk, it gave him enough strength to go back to his cushion. And he went back to his cushion and he said, I've got to wake up somehow. And he went into deep Ushin, deep emptiness. He deconstructed his mind. He went through the layers of consciousness. He got to deep Wushin. And then in this sutra, it says this: when the mind was thus concentrated, purified, bright, unblemished, rid of defilement, pliant, malleable, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed my attention to the knowledge of recollecting my past lives. I recollected my manifold past lives. In other words, 1 birth, 2 births, 5 births, 10, 50, 100, 1,000, 100,000, many aeons of cosmic contraction, many aeons of cosmic expansion, many aeons of cosmic contraction and expansion. I saw, when I looked at my past lives, there I had such a name, I belonged to such a clan, I had such an appearance. Such was my food, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such the end of my life. Passing away from that state, I re-arose somewhere else. There too, I had such a name, belonged to such a clan, had such an appearance. Such was my food, such was my experience of pleasure and pain, such the end of my life. Passing away from that state, I re-arose here. Thus, I remembered my manifold past lives in their modes and details. Okay, so I'm definitely not interested in convincing you that you have past lives. But what I do want to say is that what the Buddha is really talking about here is absolutely crucial. You know, what the Buddha says is that when I was totally blocked in my practice, even though I could go into the deepest Mushin, I hadn't wakened up because I did not understand my past lives. And when I saw all of my past lives unfolding, he says, when I saw every past life I had ever lived, I was free from all my obstructions, all my negative mental habits, and then I had my enlightenment. See, that's what he says. And in fact, he even says, not only did I see all my past lives, I saw all the past lives of everybody who has ever lived. And you might think, well, I don't believe in past lives, but let me just say, you have had past lives. Yes, you have. I have lived many lives. You know, I have been many people. I am now 72 years old. And I was a very different person, you know, when I was 5, I have to tell you. And I was a very different person when I was 12. In fact, I was a much nicer person when I was 5 than when I was 12, right? And when I was 22, I was a different person. You know, we say each of these is me, but you know, actually, you know, you have lived many lives. You have lived many cycles of birth and death in your temporal life, right? I've been many people. You know, I was just reading an article the other day where a psychologist published a study and said, you know, actually, we are not very similar to the people we were as children. We think we are, but we change hugely. So in other words, our awareness is constantly changing. We are constantly going through cycles of birth and death as we move through time. We become different people over time. And I think what the Buddha is getting at is that we keep cycling around and around and around. We're different in many ways, but we keep repeating many of the same mental habits. See, I think that's what the Buddha is getting at. What he's really saying is, I saw how I lived many lives, but I persistently carried forward mental habits that caused me suffering and caused other people suffering. those cycles of those mental cycles or mental habits, are what really causes our ignorance and delusion. And you may not know this, but the word samsara, we talk about nirvana in Buddhism, enlightenment. But samsara actually means, in Sanskrit, it means to go around and around in a circle. So actually what the Buddha is saying is, we are trapped in destructive, compulsive behaviors that we keep repeating over and over and over again through our lives. And they continue to cause us suffering, and they continue to cause others suffering, see? So in the language of the sutra, the Buddha, the language of 500 BC, the Buddha is talking about how our lives are in process and how we get trapped in these cycles of death and rebirth. We keep coming back as the same person in suffering the same ways. So, in the modern world, actually psychiatrists and psychologists are fascinated by the problem of compulsive repetition, right? If you have ever gone to talk to a psychotherapist, one of the things that the psychotherapist is usually interested in is the ways you carry forward in your future life all of these mental habits that proved maladaptive in your earlier life, right? We are often unaware of those habits. They shape us at such a deep level. Later Buddhism developed a term for these habits of compulsive behavior. They called them vasana, or habit energies, right? So we all have habit energies. This is actually what's meant, at least in the Mahayana, by karma. Karma doesn't mean if you do a good deed today, you're going to get, you'll find $20 on the sidewalk tomorrow. It means that, we respond to events in ways that create habit energies, or you could say conditioned responses. And then, we keep repeating those events. When we initially respond to our circumstances, often our response is effective, So, if you're bullied on the playground when you're a kid and you become explosively angry, they might actually leave you alone. And maybe on other occasions, becoming explosively angry helps you to deal with your problems. But at some point, your habit energy of explosive anger, becomes destructive to you and to those around you. But, if it becomes a deeply ingrained habit, you may not even be aware of it. So, people who have anger issues, are often totally unaware that they have anger issues. I had a friend, a colleague of mine at work, and I said, you have anger issues. He got so mad at me. He said, I don't have any anger issues. It was invisible to him, but he's not alone. This is what's meant by karma. Compulsive repetition is the way we move forward in time unless we can liberate ourselves, see? So what the Buddha is talking about in this crucial moment in the sutra is he's basically saying, I saw how I kept repeating the same behaviors over and over again, unaware that I was carrying them forward. But when I could see the patterns, the energy habits over time, I was able to free myself from them. And when I was able to free myself from them, I was liberated. And that is in the sutra when the Buddha said, I encountered what he calls the deathless or the unborn. That is complete awakening. It's called in Sanskrit Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, complete awakening, enlightenment, without karmic remainder. And karmic remainder means that the Buddha no longer carried forward compulsive behaviors, see. So It's important to understand that emptiness is the door we all must pass through on the way to enlightenment. Not only personal enlightenment, but social transformation, right? Many of our habit energies come from the culture we live in and not from our own experience, So I live in the United States where people are raised to be extremely competitive with one another. And people are not encouraged in childhood to exercise care for others. It's just the truth. It's the truth. So we imbibe these lessons, in English we say, look out for number one. It means take care of yourself, right? We imbibe these lessons early in our lives, and they also contribute to the burden of habit energies we have to work through. So simply trying to use your practice to get through tomorrow is also not liberating, right? We have to be willing to confront our karmic obstacles. We have to be willing to discover our hidden energy habits and dissolve them, see? And the way we do that is by using Ushin, actually. So emptiness meditation requires us to engage with our obstacles or discover our obstacles. And this is what koan, gung-an practice is all about, see. Gung-an practice, gung-an act like subconscious cues, you could say. Consciously, to your discriminating mind, they don't mean much, right? They don't mean much, or anything. They may make no sense at all. So I remember when I was training with my first teacher, my first shifu, Takabayashi Genki, he gave me a koan that goes like this: if you have a staff, like a walking stick, I will give you one. If you have no staff, I will take it away. See? And when I was given that koan, I did what I did with other koans. I went back and sat down on my cushion. I went into deep Ushin, and then I would repeat what are called the turning words of the koan. I'd say, give, take, give, take, see. And for a long time, nothing happens, right? It just seems like nothing's happening. But all of a sudden, the koan begins to become active on the deeper layers of your consciousness. And I began to feel emotional suffering. I began to feel anger. I began to feel a sense of, like emotional hunger, and this became stronger and stronger. At one point, I almost wanted to quit working with the koan. I just felt like this is so painful. But then, I was sitting on the cushion at a chanchi, and I suddenly realized, my parents loved my brother so much more than they loved me, and I was carrying around this sense of loss or regret and great jealousy for my brother. My brother and I had always had this tension, and I never understood it. But I realized, my parents so clearly lavished affection on me. They liked my brother more than they liked me. This happens to people. And, I was carrying around that injury for decades. And, sitting on the cushion and experiencing these emotions and having this insight into the source of my emotions, I returned to Ushin again and again. And at some point in that process, I was liberated from my habit energies. After the session, I actually called my brother and said, I love you, let's get together. My brother passed away many years ago. He had cancer. He died about 20 years ago. But But before he died, in the last years of our life together, we had a totally different relationship. I was able to be present with my brother without these energy habits obstructing my interactions with him. So this is the logic of Zen practice after emptiness, is using your whooshing power, your whooshing energy, and encountering your karmic obstacles and working through those obstacles in the way I have just described. And that, I would say, is more or less what the Buddha was describing in that Pali Sutta that I read. It's like I realized how I was repeating destructive behaviors, and I saw the patterns, and I was liberated. And in Zen practice, you go through this process again and again. We all carry many energy habits that are highly destructive. We are unaware of them. But when we sit down on the cushion, we are not Buddhas because we have not worked through our obstacles. We still have, even if you can go in deep wushin, you still have fear, anger, delusion, jealousy, envy, lust. All of those are still there. In emptiness, we feel so liberated, but in a way that liberation is incomplete or even an illusion. In order to fully awaken, you need to move from emptiness back into the world of form, back into the world of karma. And when you uncover your karmic obstacles and work them through, it's like gradually you're liberating yourself. It's like koan after koan after koan. And each time you work through an obstacle, it's like being set free a little bit more. So Zen practice is like encountering our obstacles, but each time we encounter an obstacle, we experience this wonderful release. And it's like, at first the world is small, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we become freer and freer and freer. So this is the path that Chan is designed to, this is the road of Chan. This is the path Chan is designed to take you on. And I think it closely follows the teachings of the Buddha, even though people aren't always aware of that. So, maybe I've talked for a long time. I'm sorry about that. Maybe I should stop here and just ask if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Jeff, are you there?
Thanks, Kurt.
Yes, hi, Jeff.
Hi. Just a second. I need to get my video back on here.
I know everybody's camera's off. I'm happy to see faces.
Okay, here I am. Well, thank you for the talk. I mean, you actually bring up so many things. I think, I personally have a lot of questions, but maybe I shouldn't be the first one to start with questions. We have, all our listeners here, and so maybe we can just open it up to questions. And if I don't see one, I can start with my own questions. But does anyone have questions to start out? Charu, what is the best way to share here? Just let everybody open their microphone, and I think that's fine. We have a small number of people, so if you want to just unmute yourself and ask your question, I think that's fine.
Yeah, or
Well,
We can also do the
Oh.
the quicker moment that we did last time, the quicker one, the quicker exercise. It's just like everybody to
Okay.
be silent for a couple of minutes, and whoever wants to talk, and just talk. We don't need to look at each other, and you just open your microphone and then you talk. It could be a question, it could be a feedback or some reflection regarding this talk and how that relate to your own experience. So, we could sit with it a little bit, yeah? And just, we will do that for, let's say, 25 minutes. Yeah, I will be the first, I guess. When we when I listen to the koan through the enlightenment experiences through emptiness, it makes me feel that it's very close to Western psychotherapy, and I wonder what is the difference between because Western psychotherapy does not need to enter mushin or wuxin, right? So how it's through talk therapy, like for Freudian or other method. So can you talk a little bit of that Zen way of practice in the Western psychotherapy?
Sure, that's such an important question. I think that Buddhists understood the mind in ways for many centuries, really, in ways that Western people have only begun to understand. So many assumptions about the unconscious mind go back to the time of the Buddha and later Buddhist philosophers. Only recently, like in the last century, have Western people been aware of the unconscious mind. Something like psychotherapy is a really wonderful practice, but it aims at restoring the self to functionality, right? So what a psychotherapist wants to do is to help you recover confidence in yourself and basically become a functional self. Buddhism understands that the self is real only in a limited sense, right? That, ultimately, as I said, we become many selves. None of them are really our true selves. Our true self is enlightened mind. So, when somebody has an enlightenment experience, they realize that, I call myself Kurt, I have this life, but there's a deeper self that it has no birth and no death. This is what the Buddha discovered. It's enlightened mind. So, psychotherapy is interested in you as a person struggling with your personal history. And that's a very good thing. I'm not criticizing it. But Buddhism is really about liberating you from the limitations of yourself and allowing you to experience a deeper, more liberating consciousness, which is in your Buddha nature. Does that make sense? I hope, yeah.
Kurt, I think that's helpful. I also have, I don't know if it's somewhat related. In my mind, it's related, I guess. I think the main purpose of this training is for educators that want to bring mindfulness or meditation, contemplation practices into the classroom. And I think you touched on some really important points regarding karma and rebirth. And I guess in the American context, I suspect you would have many students that don't accept rebirth, that don't accept karma, except in kind of the limited way that you proposed, like I've been reborn because I'm different now than when I was 20, or karma's habits. But in Taiwan, you would have many, many students, if not a majority, that take these things more literally, that there was actual life, not just an earlier stage of this life, but actual lives before, actual lives in the future, and that karma will, push us forward from those previous lives and into the future lives. And so in a classroom context, I guess, you have a challenge of, what are you doing here? Like, since it's a public, like everybody's here, they're not coming to a Buddhist temple. So how do you handle kind of the differences among students in understanding things like karma and rebirth? And you also mentioned that you don't think that Buddha was doing anything religious. And I would agree with, as religious studies scholar, I don't even think the concept of religion existed then, since it's socially constructed. But in the modern contemporary world, like that's an issue. Are you teaching religion in the classroom? And for some people, the difference is, is karma real, or is rebirth real? But who's defining, what religion is, or what you can and can't teach in the classroom, are questions that I think educators may have to deal with. And I'm just wondering how you would handle that, or what your perspective would be.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I would say, if you're teaching in a Buddhist milieu, say in Taiwan or someplace like that, some of these ideas would be more readily accessible. My feeling is that it's not so much the ideas that liberate as a process that liberates. Right? So even in contexts where the Buddhist way of the Buddhist tradition is not present, teachers can still produce a process that is liberating for students, yeah? And I teach in an American context, I don't, in the classroom, identify myself as Buddhist. I don't talk about karma, but I still think I teach in a very, in a Buddhist way, in a liberating way. I think it's possible for the teacher to give students tasks that require them to step out of their old ways of seeing and thinking and encounter something new, right? So, I am teaching a course this year it's like an introduction to literature class, and the theme of my class is repetition, cycles of repetition, and how we break free from cycles of repetition. I never use the word Buddhism, but we look at a number of literary works where the characters are either able to change or unable to change. So one of the works we look at is Twelfth Night, this Shakespeare play. And all of these characters in the play are stuck. They're unable to change. But there's the heroine of the play is this woman named Viola. And Viola is able, she actually changes her identity. She becomes a male. And she triggers all of these changes in the lives of all the other characters. So by leaving her old identity behind, she becomes a new person and creates this chain reaction of change. And everybody wants up better. So then, I look at a number of novels after that Shakespeare play, where, the characters are confronting are trapped in cycles of repetition, right? And, we look at the characters who are able to get free from that. And, for my students, simply working with these issues, I think helps them to see their own lives better, right? I think they themselves begin to understand, I think in some ways, the way their conventional attitudes hold them back from experiencing life more fully. So here's a class where it's not explicitly Buddhist. I'm not talking about this, sutras, but the class is really informed by Buddhist principles, and it really it's centrally concerned with the way our habit energies, even though I don't use that word, prevent us from liberating ourselves. And one of the novels we read has a character who has begun to discover this, you could say, potential for freedom by stepping out of conventional ways of thinking. So, my students will leave my course and they will never know probably that I am a Buddhist priest or that these are important matters, but I've already, I think, imparted to them something centrally liberating that will be of value to them for the rest of their lives. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I mean, it helps a lot. But if I may, I don't want to take all the time here if others have questions, but I do have a follow-up question about liberation. How are you thinking of liberation? I mean, I guess there's kind of two parts of it, because we have the word nirvana, where you would have a realization. Just like you were reading in the Nikaya, you have a realization, your karmic impulse ends, and then whereas you would be reborn in the next life normally, you're not reborn into this world anymore. So it's like an extinguishing. But in the Zen tradition, you have something else. At least I perceive it slightly different. Like Zhang Jiaru Lao Shi, she presented about the ox herding pictures, and you start out and then you go out to herd the ox, and then you grab the ox and you struggle with the ox, and then you come back to where you started. And it's kind of different than leaving the world, like in extinguishing in nirvana, but a realization of immanence in the world. And I wonder if you see these types of liberation differently, if you think that the Zen liberation may be a little different than classical nirvana, and how also do the types of, you gave some examples to the classroom, but how does that transfer? Are we going to talk about, I guess you're saying that you don't talk about it, per se, but if we're directly teaching meditation, it's maybe different than teaching an English literature class, because you're saying, look, this is a tradition that we're doing, it has a history and people may ask about it. So how would you respond to what is the liberation that we're looking for?
Well, I mean, somebody like, I think that what Zen, I think, is very good at showing is that whenever you feel like you're trapped in a binary that you can't get beyond, you step into a new context through emptiness, right? You discover a new context. So, I think Zen believes, and I believe, that we have the power to change ourselves precisely because we have no fundamental nature, right? I mean, Wei Nang says, basically, you dwell in Ushin, but you engage with the world of form, right? That's the essence of his teaching of Chan, right? And when you encounter contradictions in your life that seem insurmountable or inescapable, you yourself have done very successfully koan training. Gung-an seems to offer you insoluble contradiction. And then you step out of that, you enter emptiness, and at some point you suddenly realize, I don't have to be trapped by this contradiction. There's another framework or way of seeing, right? And that is, from the Chan standpoint, that is liberation, right? So, basically, every time you go through that process of being trapped and then stepping outside of your old self and discovering a new context, you're encountering your Buddha nature. So we can create that situation in a classroom all the time, whether we use that terminology or not, right? Yeah, Jaro?
Can I contribute to something? And I think that perhaps we could use in a more secular setting, like a university like Zhengda, Shida, Taida, for example. It's different from Huafan or Shenzhen, Jeff, you're in, because there's more Buddhist, these are Buddhist universities. But in a secular setting where all our professors are, for example, Li Xing here is an Emily Dickinson specialist. Joan teaches Shakespeare. Su Lao Shi teaches writing, right? So I think that in that situation, if we want to show the methodology of contemplative humanities, then we perhaps could use, without putting aside the Zen methodology, is to employ a comparative perspective. I could use Camus. Kurt, you talked about this literature before. Camus' Adultery Woman. I forgot the name.
Yes, Adulterous Woman. Yes, I know that story. That's great.
Adulterous Woman. It's a wonderful text. Camus is what is it? Algerian existentialist philosopher, French writer, right? And the story, you can use the story to talk about, to invite a comparative perspective for students to think about. You can use it in a setting that could invite Buddhism or not using a Buddhist vocabulary. Because okay, so here's a story. A woman goes, was in a very unhappy marriage, and he went with her husband to a desert. And when she encountered the vastness of that desert, she has a moment of awakening. And this is a wonderful ecological eco-text. If you teach nature writing, if you're an eco-critic, you talk, or if you teach a theme that talks about wonder or nature wonder, or if you teach a theme that talks about liminal space, or empty space. So there's a lot, very rich vocabulary that we can use, right? So the woman has a moment of awakening. So she cried, she cried very hard, and then realizing that the marriage is not going anywhere, and her husband just does not understand. So it's transformative for her to understand something. So that fits very well into what Kurt has been talking about in this talk, right? It's transformative, and that experiential. So literature has a power, right? So I'm using this as an example. I'm not sure about Jeff, in other outside the literature, I think film can do that. Anthropology, perhaps I could talk to my colleague who is not here, Courtney Work. Courtney is in the anthropologist. Maybe she has something to offer. And this is something I would love to do. The next step, when we have so many professors gathered together interested in this, developing this contemplative humanities, so we could probably form a work group, to because Zhenda already did a proposal of almost 500,000 proposal for this many courses. So we I starting it's a 5-year program. Starting the 3rd year, we would probably have to propose a new course and call teaching team teach course. Could invite literature, professors and anthropology all come to teach. So we would probably need to do something like what Kurt was talking about, like to have a theme repetition, and then we can identify like 12 nights, so we can have an English professor come to teach, and we can have an anthropologist, come to teach on this theme, or we can have another theme, liminal space for transformation, right? And we could work on it and develop those courses. So I'm very excited about that.
Can I just return to that wonderful Camus story, because that is such a great example, and students who read the story need to go through a process of re-seeing themselves, right? I've taught that, I teach that story, I teach the short story every year, right? In the short story course at Rutgers, I teach every year. And I teach that story because it's such a Zen story, even though, basically students read that and they don't understand how she's adulterous, right? They take it literally, the adulterous wife, she never has an affair, so how is she adulterous, right? And there's a contradiction or an anomaly in the story. She never commits adultery, and yet she has that experience of going out on the parapet and looking at the desert and experiencing this vastness, right? It forces them to re-understand many things, their understanding of the term adultery has to change, right? So they have to step out of a familiar context to make sense of the story. And when they do, there's like a little opening. So it's very much like just reading the story and not understanding it at first produces something like a moment of Zen insight or Chan insight.
What is that novel? Hawthorne, there's also adultery. What is it? A Scarlet Letter. Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne. The woman also, she wear a clothes with an A. And
Yes.
she committed adultery, right? And so in that, what is it? The Puritan society.
Yes.
So and in the end, the people start to see A differently. Your adultery start to transform into something else. So anyway, it was just sort of just another novel that perhaps could to be added.
In English, there's this term Gestalt switch, right? Gestalt switch. Yeah. Gestalt switch is actually very important for Zen practice. You seem to be in a context that has an intrinsically irresolvable contradiction, and suddenly you step out and realize there's no contradiction. So creating that situation in the classroom is really a Zen pedagogy, if you want to call it that, a Chan pedagogy.
Yeah, and I just want to use this opportunity to let teachers, professors here understand that the way more the teacher training program, meditation is helping us to have those experiential, transformative, sort of gestalt experience, this moment. So that's why meditation is very important, and we are not, and this contemplative humanity is not just teaching meditation, or like the way mindfulness. I try to turn Zen into a pedagogy, into a teaching pedagogy, and koan is definitely one of the teaching pedagogy. And doing koan really needs to really practice in order to understand how it works. So that's why some people might wonder, why meditation? Can we just do something else? Yes, but meditation is still, a sitting meditation is still more important. We should definitely incorporate, into teaching pedagogy, walking, observing, maybe tea ceremony, other kinds of contemplative activities, but sitting is still, because it's the most direct way of doing it. And then when we have those experience, then we can look at the literary text very differently, and or whatever text that you want to use in your contemplative courses. Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning from Hong Kong, and thank you so much, Professor Spellmeyer, for your sharing today. And I want to ask the questions, but I feel so shy. Such a long time to speak English in front of lots of people. Yes, I think all of your sharing is very related to my experience. I'm not sure have I entered the state of emptiness, but for now, currently I'm under supervisions and practicing under the supervisions of Professor John, and so I can feel that during the process, I can observe so many circles, and I think the process of practicing for me is like keep reconstructing my understanding of the world. That is how I feel. And I have questions about that. When I keep practicing, I can observe my karma and my circles, but how it relates to the social problems, because I also have so many critiques of the social inequalities and the social structures. So I would like to know what is the connections between my